A black CEO was set up on live TV, but his response was so brutal, even the audience turned on the host. The studio lights cast a soft glow over the sleek, modern set of The Sterling Hour, one of the most watched morning shows in the country, the kind of program that suburban households had running in the background while sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones. At the center of it all sat Valerie Sterling, a polished, sharp-featured host with the kind of charisma that made her both respected and feared in the industry. She had built her reputation on tough interviews, disarming politicians, grilling Hollywood elites, and throwing curveballs at CEOs who thought they were walking into a friendly chat. Today, her guest was Nathaniel Kane, founder and CEO of Sentient Dynamics, a tech giant at the forefront of AI research. He wasn't just successful, he was the face of a new era, a man whose company had reshaped industries and disrupted the status quo. His innovations were being used in hospitals, law enforcement, financial markets, everywhere. But none of that was what made today's interview a topic of speculation. What had the audience waiting with quiet anticipation was something much more unspoken. Nathaniel Kane was a black man in a space historically dominated by white faces, and that, more than anything, made him a target for subtle but calculated scrutiny. He sat calmly in his chair, wearing a crisp navy blue suit, his expression unreadable as the countdown to live broadcast began. There was no sign of nerves, no anxious twitch of the hands. This wasn't his first time on national television, and it certainly wasn't his first time dealing with people like Valerie. Across from him, Valerie crossed her legs and offered her signature smile, polite, warm on the surface, but with an edge so fine you'd only notice it if you were really paying attention. The camera's red light blinked on. She turned to the audience, her voice smooth and practiced. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we have a fascinating conversation ahead. Our guest is a man who has built one of the most influential companies of our time, shaping the way we interact with artificial intelligence. But with power comes responsibility and controversy." She pivoted, locking eyes with Nathaniel. "Mr. Kane, thank you for being here." Nathaniel gave a slight nod. "Appreciate the invitation." Valerie's smile widened just enough to show teeth. "Well, let's get right into it. You've had an impressive rise, one that many have called unprecedented. A lot of people look at your success and wonder, is this a testament to merit or to a system trying to correct past injustices?" The words were laced with something deeper, a challenge, a bait, a question designed not to be answered but to provoke. Nathaniel exhaled slowly through his nose, already recognizing the game she was about to play. But what Valerie didn't know was that he had already won before she even started. The audience? They weren't ready for what was about to happen next. Nathaniel kept his expression neutral, but inside he was already calculating. He'd been in boardrooms where the stakes were higher than this. He'd sat across from investors who barely concealed their skepticism, men who would glance at his skin before they glanced at his credentials. Valerie Sterling? She was just another test. The silence stretched for a second too long, just enough for the audience to feel it. Then he finally spoke. "That's an interesting way to phrase it," Nathaniel said, his tone smooth, controlled. "Are you asking if I earned my success, or if it was handed to me?" Valerie gave a short, practiced laugh, the kind designed to make a guest feel silly for even suggesting such a thing. "Oh, not at all, Nathaniel. I'm simply saying that we live in a time where companies are prioritizing diversity initiatives, and of course that's a good thing. But some people, our viewers included, might wonder if programs like these tilt the playing field in a way that, let's say, benefits some more than others. A low murmur rippled through the audience. The tension in the room was subtle, but growing, the kind of moment where viewers at home would lean in just a little closer. Nathaniel's jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't stiffen. He didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. "Let's break that down," he said, his voice even. "You're suggesting that companies making an effort to include historically excluded talent somehow erases merit. But if that were true, why is it that when I walk into a room full of CEOs, I'm still the only one who looks like me?" The words landed heavy, and for the first time Valerie's composure wavered. "Well, it's a complicated issue," she started, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. "Is it?" he asked, his voice still measured, "because it sounds pretty simple to me. What's actually happening is that for the first time, people who are always qualified are finally getting their shot. But when someone like me rises to the top, people don't ask how many hours I worked, how many sacrifices I made, how many nights I spent building something from the ground up. Instead, they ask, did the system give you a handout?" A single clap echoed from somewhere in the audience before it was quickly stifled. Valerie straightened in her seat, regaining her footing. "I think what people are wondering—" "No," Nathaniel cut in smoothly. "I think what you're wondering is if I deserve to be here." Silence. For the first time, Valerie's practiced smile faltered just slightly, just enough for the camera to catch. Nathaniel leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, completely unbothered. "I get it," he continued, his tone shifting almost conversational. "It's easier to believe that someone like me was handed something than to admit that the system kept people like me out for decades. But here's the thing, Valerie. I don't need anyone's permission to sit at this table." The room felt smaller now, the tension pressing against the walls. But Valerie wasn't done yet, and she was about to make a mistake she couldn't take back. Valerie's smile returned, but it was tighter now, stretched a little too thin. The audience wasn't shifting in their seats, but they weren't relaxed either. She had to regain control. This was her show. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head slightly, as if the whole exchange had been some friendly intellectual debate rather than a moment that had millions of viewers locked in. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice adopting that patronizing tone used by people who think they're being subtle, "I think you're misunderstanding me. No one is questioning your intelligence or your talent. You've built something incredible. But in this country, we do have to acknowledge that certain initiatives, such as diversity hiring, have changed the way businesses operate. And many believe that while the intention is good, it sometimes results in less qualified individuals being elevated over those who may have been better suited for the role. Do you see how that could be a concern?" There it was. She wasn't hiding it anymore. Nathaniel exhaled quietly. Not out of frustration, but with the kind of patience you develop after years of hearing the same thing over and over again from people who truly believe they were saying something original. "I see exactly what you're saying," he replied, nodding once. "But let me ask you this. When was the last time someone sat across from a white CEO and asked if they really deserve their position? When was the last time a Fortune 500 company hired an average white man, and someone turned around and said, well, maybe he didn't earn it. Maybe he's just here because of the system helping people like him?" Valerie opened her mouth, but Nathaniel wasn't done. "Because if we're going to talk about unearned opportunities, let's be honest about where that conversation really belongs. He paused for effect. For decades, centuries even, companies have been run by men who all look the same, and no one ever questioned whether they deserved to be there. No one ever said, hey, maybe that CEO got a head start because his father was in the same industry. Or maybe that executive was promoted because he went to the right country club instead of working harder than everyone else. The audience was completely silent now. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. Why is it that when someone like me succeeds, we suddenly want to have this conversation about merit? Valerie swallowed. She could feel the shift happening, not just in the room, but on the screens across the country. But she wasn't going down without a fight. She forced a small chuckle, attempting to regain her footing. I think we're getting a little off track here, she said. Are we? Nathaniel asked, his voice still even, because it seems to me that we're finally on the right track. The tension had evolved into something else now, something sharper, and then Valerie made the mistake. Well, she said, her tone cooling just slightly, I think some people might argue that in industries like yours, Nathaniel, companies do lower the bar to meet certain expectations. The room reacted before Nathaniel even did. There was a shift in the air, a collective inhale, the kind of moment where people realized a line had been crossed. Nathaniel didn't blink, didn't flinch. He simply looked at her for a moment, studied her, then leaned forward, rested his hands on his knee, and said calmly, If you think the bar has been lowered, then let's raise it right here, right now. The camera zoomed in. The audience was hanging on every syllable, but no one was ready for what he was about to say next. Nathaniel's words lingered in the air, hanging over the studio like a storm cloud about to break. Valerie's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She wasn't used to being the one caught off guard. She had expected pushback, maybe even a heated debate, but not this, not a challenge thrown back at her with such precision. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, controlled, intentional. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, deliberate. You say the bar has been lowered. Let's test that. He turned slightly, addressing not just Valerie but everyone watching, the millions of people tuning in from their living rooms, their office cubicles, their morning coffee shops. You said earlier that diversity initiatives might be giving opportunities to people who don't deserve them. But let's look at the numbers. Right now, there are exactly 6 black CEOs in the Fortune 500. Out of 500. That's just over 1%. He let that sink in before continuing. Now tell me, if the bar were truly being lowered to make room for people like me, wouldn't those numbers look a little different? A murmur rippled through the studio audience. Valerie's fingers twitched slightly on the stack of cue cards in front of her, but she didn't interrupt. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, voice steady. You know what I had to do to get here, Valerie. I had to build a company from nothing. I had to pitch investors who assumed I was the assistant when I walked into the room. I had to outperform my competition 10 times over because I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't just be seen as Nathaniel Kane failing. I'd be seen as proof that people like me don't belong in this space. He paused. The weight of his words settled deep. Meanwhile, he continued, there are executives sitting at the top of billion-dollar corporations right now who got their positions because their father made a few phone calls, and nobody questions whether they belong. The audience was nodding now, shifting in their seats. People weren't just listening, they were absorbing. Valerie tried to regain control. She shifted slightly, straightening the papers in front of her. Nathaniel, she said, I think you're making some broad generalizations. No one is denying that you've worked hard, but the reality is the reality. Nathaniel cut in smoothly. Is that people only ask these questions when someone who looks like me succeeds. When a white executive takes the helm of a major company, no one assumes they got there because of a diversity initiative. No one ever turns to them and says, "Hey, do you think you got this job because someone lowered the bar?" He let the question hang in the air, a mirror reflecting back at her. Valerie opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Nathaniel exhaled lightly through his nose, shaking his head just a fraction. Then he delivered the final blow. "You don't actually care about merit," he said quietly, looking her in the eye. "You care about keeping people like me from having a seat at the table. And that, Valerie, is the real conversation." The silence in the room was deafening. Valerie's face had lost its smooth composure, her carefully curated on-air persona cracking just enough for the camera to catch it. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnessing something. And that's when everything changed. For the first time in her career, Valerie Sterling looked rattled. It was slight, barely a shift in her posture. But it was there. The kind of moment so subtle, yet so damning, that millions of viewers at home would rewind and replay just to confirm what they saw. She tried to recover. She had to. "Well, Nathaniel," she began, her voice softer now, careful, "I think we can all agree that these conversations are nuanced. No one is saying you haven't worked hard." Nathaniel smiled. Not the kind of smile you offer in agreement. The kind that tells the other person, "I see exactly what you're doing." "Except that's exactly what you're saying," he replied smoothly. "You didn't bring me on here to talk about my company. You didn't want to discuss the technology we're developing, the ways it's shaping the future. You brought me here to ask if I truly earned my place. And that question, Valerie, is the problem." Valerie inhaled sharply, but Nathaniel wasn't finished. "You see, when people like me succeed, people like you feel the need to investigate, to analyze, to find some reason why we shouldn't be here. But when people who look like you succeed, it's just expected. No one questions it. No one asks if the system handed them an opportunity they didn't deserve." His voice never rose. He never lost his composure. And yet he had turned the entire interview into something she never anticipated, a lesson. "I've spent my entire career proving myself to people who started 10 steps ahead of me," Nathaniel continued, his eyes locked on hers. "And I'll keep doing it. Not because I need their validation, but because I refuse to let the next generation of people who look like me grow up thinking they have to apologize for their own success." The audience reacted before Valerie could. A few claps at first, then more. Then the kind of applause that wasn't just polite. It was a statement. Valerie glanced toward the control booth, likely searching for a lifeline. But there wasn't one. Not this time. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "we certainly appreciate your perspective." It was a weak ending to a battle she had already lost. Nathaniel Kane sat back in his chair, perfectly composed. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just let the moment sit, knowing that nothing else needed to be said. But the real storm was only just beginning. The moment the interview ended, Valerie Sterling didn't linger. She gave a quick, tight-lipped smile, muttered something about appreciating the conversation, and turned away before the cameras even finished fading to black. Nathaniel Kane, on the other hand, took his time. He rose from his chair with measured ease, adjusted his suit jacket, and shook the hands of the producers and crew members as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something irreversible. By the time he stepped off set and into the hallway, his phone was already vibrating non-stop. Texts, emails, notifications. His assistant, Jordan, was waiting for him by the green room door. Eyes wide. "You've seen it already?" Nathaniel asked, barely amused. Jordan turned his screen around. "It's everywhere." And it was. Clips of the exchange were flooding social media at a speed no PR team could control. The hashtag number Nathaniel Kane was already trending, followed closely by number Sterling exposed and number lower the bar, the phrase he had flipped back on Valerie now being used as a rallying cry. Memes were popping up by the second. One side of the internet was celebrating, calling it one of the most satisfying takedowns in television history. The other side scrambling for damage control, twisting narratives. Nathaniel scrolled through his phone as they walked, catching glimpses of the chaos unfolding. A viral tweet. Valerie Sterling just learned in real time that some men come prepared for the ambush. A clip circulating on YouTube. This is what happens when you challenge a man who built his empire from the ground up. Watch until the end, she had nothing left. Then, of course, the counterattacks. A headline from a certain network. Did Nathaniel Kane bully a female host on live TV? A debate or a public shaming? Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. The spin was predictable. He had been in this game long enough to know that when people lost an argument, they tried to rewrite it. Jordan shook his head, still scrolling. Sterling's team is in full damage control mode. They're saying she was just asking the tough questions, and that you overreacted. Nathaniel gave a low chuckle, tucking his phone into his pocket. Of course they are. But the world had already made up its mind. That night, the Sterling Hour's official YouTube channel uploaded the full interview. Not an edited version, not the carefully clipped, PR-approved highlights. The whole thing, uncut. Within 2 hours, it was the number. One trending video. By morning, it had 12 million views. Corporate America was watching. Media executives were watching. Valerie's sponsors were definitely watching. And for the first time, she was the one under scrutiny. It wasn't just about a bad interview anymore. It was about a long-standing pattern being dragged into the light. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's inbox was filling with something else entirely. Opportunities, speaking requests, interviews, a feature in a major business magazine. People weren't just praising his performance. They wanted to hear more. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just a viral moment. This was the beginning of something much bigger.